Okay, let's just dive right into this explainer. Think of this as your ultimate study guide to the cosmos. As a systems neuroscientist, I spend a massive amount of my time thinking about how the brain works. But today, we're going to pull the lens way, way back. We are literally going to track the exact physics of how human consciousness emerges from the Big Bang. It's this incredible, unbroken sequence where higher levels of existence are totally rooted in the lower ones. But, and this is key, they're never fully exhausted by them.
Here's our syllabus for today's journey. We'll hit the physics of the cosmic origin, move into the mechanics of emergence, and then tackle this wild concept called the master ratio. From there, we'll map out the 7 faces of the self before wrapping up with consciousness as the crown jewel. I'll be your guide, tracing this chronological arc from the birth of the universe right up to those neural networks firing inside your head at this exact second. All right, Section 1, Physics of the Cosmic Origin. To really understand the mind, we got to ground our philosophical journey in hard thermodynamic physics, starting literally at the dawn of time.
This is where physical science and ancient philosophy actually crash into each other in the best way. Take the ancient concept of Purnam, this idea of the infinite emerging from itself. While in fundamental physics, that perfectly mirrors the Big Bang. The universe starts at a point horizon, and the intense physical forces at play establish the very first thermodynamic attractors. Think of these as energy minima, or like stable resting states, that gave the newborn cosmos its first sense of stability.
Keep these foundational points in mind for your study guide, because this initial energy gradient is basically the bedrock for the whole shebang. Without those first energy attractors forming out of the Big Bang, you don't get chemistry, you definitely don't get life, and there's absolutely no way you get a brain. It's step 1 in an epic cascade of complexity.
Moving on to Section 2, the mechanics of emergence. Now we meet the twin engines of creation driving every biological system we know. This is where the physics of the universe starts looking a whole lot like biology. Let's start with engine number 1, entropy. Now, you've probably heard entropy described as just disorder or things decaying, but in dynamical systems theory, entropy is not just chaos, it's actually the necessary fuel that lets a system explore new configurations. It's the freedom of exploration. Without a little bit of thermodynamic noise, a system is just frozen. It can't discover anything new. Entropy is literally the engine of novelty.
On the flip side, we've got our second engine, attractors. If entropy is the freedom to explore, attractors are the strength of constraint. Picture a landscape filled with deep valleys. Those valleys are the attractors. They pull systems down into stable, organized patterns. They compress behavior, lower the local entropy, and basically give a system its structural coherence.
So let's trace this cascade of emergence. Emergence happens right at the sweet spot where these two forces intersect. You need enough entropy to explore, but enough attractor-driven constraint to build these complex layers. Look at how physical fields lead right into chemical networks. Then, chemistry locks into metabolic life. Metabolism sets the stage for gene regulatory networks. And finally, those gene networks lay the groundwork for neural dynamics. Each layer builds on the one below it, restricting its entropy just enough to create a stable, brand new pattern.
Your big takeaway here is that life isn't some static object. It's not a rock or a crystal. It is a thermodynamically self-maintaining flow that actively manages entropy to fight off disorder. Embryogenesis, an embryo developing, is the perfect example. There's no master blueprint or tiny architect calling the shots. It's pure emergence, driven by local interactions settling into biological attractors. All right, Section 3, the master ratio, measuring energy versus information. This is absolutely crucial. It's a mathematical tipping point where biology actually turns into mind. Like, how do we get from a rigid liver cell to a super-fast, flexible thought? Well, here is the magic formula, the master ratio, or the EI ratio. Grounded in control theory, this is a predictive marker that explains how life upgrades from basic physical chemistry to a highly intelligent, predictive system. It simply measures the physical energy required to change a biological state divided by the informational value you gain from making that change.
What's fascinating here is the sheer contrast between our biological hardware on the left and our cognitive software on the right. We have deep attractors like those gene regulatory networks. They have a really high EI ratio. It takes a massive amount of metabolic energy to change a cell's fate. That high EI locks a cell into its physical identity. It forces a heart cell to stay a heart cell. But on the other side, we have shallow attractors, our neural networks. They operate on a low EI ratio. Changing states up there is cheap and reversible, using fast electrical spikes. And that is what enables the rapid, flexible cognition we use to adapt and think. This is a real game changer. When that EI ratio drops below a critical threshold, the biological system totally shifts its strategy. It goes from just trying to stay the exact same kind of cell to optimizing for high-dimensional adaptability. That drop in the master ratio, that's the exact threshold where intelligence and behavior actually become biologically possible.
On to Section 4, the 7 faces of the self. Let's map out this unbroken arc visually, stepping sequentially from basic information all the way up to the human ego. Our journey hits 7 stations. It starts with Face I, the eternal observer, the witness that acts as our ultimate subjective anchor. Then we hit Phase 2, where life itself is a continuous process fighting off entropy. And Phase 3 is intelligence, which emerges purely as a survival strategy, a system constantly chasing energy, using prediction and error correction to survive a chaotic universe. Next up, we flow through bioenergetics, the sheer physical effort to hold energy against entropy, bridging straight into neuroscience at Phase V. Here, rhythmic brainwaves like theta and gamma act as those shallow attractors we talked about, building our perceptions. And all of this feeds into Phase 6, the ego. From a systems standpoint, the ego isn't mystical, it's a deep, high-energy attractor. It's this massive basin of identity anchored by who I am and how I act, which our moment-to-moment perceptions constantly fall into. And this right here brilliantly illustrates why you are so fundamentally different from artificial intelligence, bringing us to Phase 7. Look, AI is incredibly powerful, no doubt, but it's completely disembodied. A biological self roots its identity in physical, metabolic survival. It closes the loop of autonomous error correction because, well, if a biological system fails to predict its environment, it dies. AI lacks this true identity control loop because it literally doesn't have a biological metabolism to keep alive. Notice how these 7 faces serve as a full syllabus for selfhood. The thinker behind these words isn't some magical ghost in the machine. It is anchored heavily by deep physical and metabolic loops. Your ego is essentially the ultimate narrative attractor stabilizing your very existence.
Finally, Section 5, Consciousness, as the crown jewel. We've reached the peak of our curriculum. This is the exact moment where memory stops being just a stored chemical bias and transforms into actual subjective experience. Consider this absolutely profound idea. Consciousness is not a thing, but a trajectory through a high-dimensional memory space. It emerges when memory becomes self-referential. And crucially, it exists at what researchers call a metastable intermediate attractor depth. Basically, a Goldilocks zone. If your brain's attractors are too deep and rigid, you get stuck, leading to perseveration or even a coma. If they're too shallow and chaotic, too much entropy, you get psychosis or delirium. Consciousness serves that perfect razor-thin boundary between rigid order and chaotic entropy. And here is the completed loop. The universe, starting right at the Big Bang, goes through billions of years of balancing entropy and attractors, cascading through physics, chemistry, biology, and neural dynamics. And it ultimately creates a system capable of observing the universe itself, meaning the conscious self is the magnificent, emergent result of the exact physics and entropy it's now trying to understand. How wild is that? As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to really let this final question sink in. If you are quite literally the cosmos looking back at itself through a high-dimensional narrative attractor, what does it truly mean to be yourself? Like, how does it feel to know that your very identity, your ego, is the universe's ultimate way of balancing chaos and order? It's a lot to chew on, right? Thanks so much for joining me on this incredible journey. Keep exploring and keep learning.